And we're today talking about conversion rate optimization, CRO, and I'm joined by our good friends Yusuf and Yaseen, both from Prismfly. Hi guys. Now Prismfly is one of our favorite agency partners for CRO. You guys have been acing it for a number of brands. So let's start. What is CRO? What would that do for a brand?
Yeah, I might kick us off, and I'll pass it over to Yusuf. I think in general, when we first started off, especially me, I had this misconception that CRO was purely testing, because testing is a big part of kind of the tools in the tool shed underneath the umbrella of CRO. But the truth is that CRO is a lot more than just testing. It's really all encompassing. The way I like to view it is anything possible to figure out why a customer's not buying, at least in the sense of e-commerce, or why they're not taking the desired action, right? But Yusuf, you might add to that.
Yeah. So my take is that a good, there's CRO, right? Like conversion rate optimization, right? Which many people see that conversion as purchases. It could really be any conversion. But absolutely, it's like getting people to buy. But you can do that in two very different ways, right? There's ways that companies might do sort of more gimmicky stuff, which you don't really want to do for your branding. And then there's things that are authentic, that improve the user experience, that improve the brand reputation, make people feel good, and then they're going to purchase as a result of that. And that's really what you want to have LTV and a strong brand later down the road. And so you've seen a lot of companies kind of talk about like customer first CRO or like user-centric CRO, right? But ultimately what that's trying to say is, don't just be so focused on your purchase conversion rate over time, because if you dump in bad ad traffic, you're going to have a bad conversion rate at any given point. But we've had brands come to us with 7, 8, 9, 10% conversion rate who are thrilled and ready to have CRO. And here's why. They see that program as an opportunity to benchmark where they're at in the customer experience, identify where they want to go. And then we're the group that's basically very good at figuring out the steps to get there and actioning against that, kind of creating a strategy that's prioritized. And as we're building on that roadmap, we're reprioritizing with new data, new learnings, which is why we love Littledata. But yeah, so that's kind of the way we see it. Is it's sort of like a holistic program approach. And in a way, the website for us is our product that we're trying to optimize and make better, while merchants, their focus is often on the marketing, the shipping and logistics, and making sure that their physical products are the best that they can be.
I guess to pick on that previous point, Yusuf, the tactics you employ as a CRO actually depend, as you say, where they're benchmarking different areas of the site. So it might be more about kind of design, imagery. That might be where they're weak. It might just be about simple kind of user experience, like as button clarity.
Yeah.
It might be about copy, but I guess the kind of tools you need depend on the brand's performance.
Exactly. And there's definitely some where it's like they've got awful imagery, and sometimes you've got brands that are like, let's invest in new imagery. Sometimes we say, we've had scenarios with clothing brands where they service petite and plus size customers, and we're like, hey, let's have an option like aloyoga.com, amazing option. I think I've seen it on, I think their bras and some of the women's tops, where you can select from, you can switch the model, right? They don't go into necessarily sizing, but they allow you to switch the model so you can potentially see the item on different skin tones, on different sizes. And that's huge, right? It adds an element of personalization, but that requires an investment. There might be another brand that is like, hey, we just spent X amount on photography. We can't touch it. We can't afford it. So we're like, cool, totally fine. There's plenty of other wins elsewhere. But Yaseen, I don't know if there's anything you're going to add.
Well, I was going to add to that and just say that, sort of this kind of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like, you have to first define what success looks like, and then, you do a lot of things, then you try to understand, well, did we reach success or not? And so technically, CRO is something that really anybody could be using as well. Like, I sometimes think about, like, could you change the store layout in a coffee shop and see if that optimizes the amount of purchases you get after a long day, because someone sits there and buys more. So there's just, it's really all about, what do I want and did I get there or not? and then how am I measuring against that? You know,
Yeah.
and so the beauty is that in e-commerce, that's, you know, doable.
Really easy.
And actually, to take a small meander, I mean, we were talking earlier about McDonald's, and obviously, like, actually, restaurant menu optimization is a big thing, right? That's a whole other branch of CRO. You're actually just trying to get people to choose the right options or choose any option.
Totally. Back when I was in, a funny anecdote. So shortly after McDonald's acquired some testing tools to do that, I remember trying to get the company I was working with back when I was in New York. I was trying to get them because they knew people at MTA, like the Transit Association. I was trying to get them to like connect with us as a client, because I was like, man, we could definitely optimize like when people buy their like Metro cards and stuff, you know, like maybe offer deals or something. We'll have like a spin to win or something on the Metro card. You know, hey, do you want to run the lottery and get the unlimited 30-day option?
Obviously, unfortunately, MTA not a classically sort of profit-driven company, so probably not that interested in optimization like that, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So kind of what for your agency, like when would a typical kind of brand benefit from this? Is there a certain scale or complexity they need to get to before this makes sense as investment?
Yeah, I'll probably start us off there. If I miss anything, definitely let me know, Yusuf. I think at least so far as working with an external agency like a Prismfly, normally what we find is brands will get to, let's call it 5-10 million per year, and they're starting to see some plateau. They know they need to level up their website. Maybe they've kind of Frankenstein the theme. The design has been put together by someone that maybe is a graphic designer, a generalist designer, but they're not a specialist in UX UI. So they're kind of at that level where they really need to build out all these resources, but it's expensive to hire a lead full stack engineer. It's expensive to hire a lead designer, a CRO consultant that understands statistics and so have you, a data analyst, right? A PM, a QA. There's really a lot of roles that go into doing this correctly. And if you put all those roles together and take US salaries, that could be $500,000-$600,000. And so you kind of reach that point where it makes sense to say, okay, well, let's hire a fractional partner that can get us all those resources in one. Yep. And normally to be able to afford that and see the ROI on the work that team is doing, you're kind of probably doing at least 5 to 10 million plus per year. Yep. But I would add to that, there's a point where there might be diminishing returns, or it may not make as much sense. For example, we don't really serve enterprise customers, let's call it doing over 500 million per year. Yeah. We're not really servicing, because at that point they probably have a team of 50 people that are, a lot more sophisticated than even anyone,
Oh, you're muted.
I think you're muted, Yusuf.
You're muted, Yusuf, I think. Hang on. Yeah.
I was going to say, unfortunately, for those $500 million groups and up, unfortunately, even if they have a really sophisticated team, you're often more consulting on politics of an organization rather than the actual work.
Oh, wants to test this, wants to test this.
Yeah, exactly. I used to beat my head against the wall for 6 months trying to get one initiative across the board. And at that 6-month mark, they would say something like, hey, you know what? What if we did this? And I'm like, you don't say it. Like I said that at month 1,
Yeah, but you made a really good point there, though, that as you say, that for a kind of mid to size brand, you could do this in-house, but the problem is you don't know which of those skill sets you're going to need. So actually the advantage, I guess, of having agencies, you say, there's no politics involved. You just say, look, objectively, where you guys are at, you need this skill, and we can do that with you. We don't need to do the rest.
Totally. Yeah. And I think one thing to throw out is like, optimizing your website is something that every brand needs from day one, really. The question is, to our point earlier, right? A/B testing might be something that comes in later once you have a little bit more traffic in the 50 to 100,000 session a month range, right? But really, it's like you can be a $1 million per year brand, and there's still a lot you can do to optimize your website. Like maybe your design is just trash, right? And it's like, that a better design is something your customers are going to appreciate, and you can use. They call it user testing, not the best name. It's sort of like focus grouping different versions of your website, right? Seeing if they're more confusing or not, run surveys, right? As long as you're paying attention to the customer voice and doing different research that allows you to get to that, and also looking at quantitative data, where's the drop-offs, you can still make a lot of improvements without running actual A/B tests, where you're relying on statistical significance. Making a faster website is going to be helpful for a big brand and a small brand. It's just investing in a resource that's really dialed and really good and can bring all those bells and whistles. That's usually where the ROI makes sense, around 5 million a year. So a group like us can pay for ourselves every month, and they can sit back and focus on what they do best.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, certainly we take that advice ourselves a little later, that actually, we don't really have enough traffic to do true CRO, but actually you can run, a sequence of experiments where, obviously you can't really, adjust for things like traffic quality and stuff over that period. But you can say if the change is big enough, we should see enough of uplift. Obviously, as you say, as you get to scale, you can get a bit more, a bit more specific about smaller changes.
I'll add to that, Ed. When we think about kind of all the metrics that get pulled together, like in measuring against statistical confidence, Yusuf always brings up a great point that you want to have the highest level of statistical confidence possible, but at the same time, it's not necessarily medical device sales. Where you're creating a drug that has to be 99% or else lives are lost. So if I run a website on my B2B site that only has several thousand sessions a month, I mean, even if I see a 60% lift, I'm like, hey, that's good, right? We're not losing lives on that. And so there's also a risk tolerance factor to include. And I think that, you can be doing this type of work for sure, even from day one.
Right. If you're not doing something that's going to hurt your brand, and 90% of initiatives aren't going to destroy a brand, if you will. And so it's like, maybe if you're Netflix, you can gear to that and have a massive amount of data, or things are more nuanced. But it's like, if you're trying to look for 95% stat sig on every test as a middle market brand who most people are just seeing for the first time, it's not the end of the world, right? It's not that big of a deal. I think the one thing to be considerate about is, are you moving things and changing things that customers who are coming back might be relying on? So when you think about those tools, it's like login, the cart location, recently viewed, those are kind of tools in a way. And so moving those, even if it is to a better location, that can throw off some of your return customers. That's one where you might say, hey, let's hide this test from new customers. And if we do make that change, it'll suck for a couple weeks for our old customers, but we'll just rip off the Band-Aid if it does work for the new customer. So there's also some things like that. But
please ask any questions in the chat if you have any. They come through here. Let's move on. I think I remember talking previously, did a little presentation for us internally a little later about kind of some common hacks. And can you give me sort of 3 ideas of like what are the kind of things? And maybe some of our listeners are struggling to think, what does CRO really change? What are some of the things that you've seen impact?
So and this kind of comes from, again, it's like best practices lie, right? So it's like the best thing to do is kind of test things out. But ultimately, there are things that as an agency we find work pretty well the majority of time across industry, which is fantastic. And those kind of go into our test bank, which is quite long, quite extensive. And that's how we really hit the ground running with brands. But to kind of start off with, like some of the simple ones that are really easy are, if you go to the standard Shopify checkout, particularly on mobile, because probably 85% of your customers are on mobile, right next to the button to proceed to the next step or to move forward, right underneath that, there's a text link that'll say, do you want to go back? And they also have the breadcrumb at the top that they can go back. They can use their browser to go back. And so there's other mechanisms of going back, but that's kind of a blatantly obvious, question asking someone, do you want to second guess your purchase? Like, are you totally sure? Which can introduce doubt and drop off. And so an easy test that we run often is removing that. Sometimes depending on the brand or considerations for different steps, we might, try a multivariate test, seeing if we only remove at certain stages. But long story short, you remove that button. We've seen anywhere from 5 upwards of 15% increase in conversion rate, like across the whole site, removing one link. Because remember, that's the one funnel point that everybody's going through, and the button that everybody has to click in order to proceed through to buy. So as high as 15% with statistical significance of 95% above. So it's not always that great, but it could be a 5% increase in your annual revenue.
With no real downside,
Another good one that we see often is also in the checkout, changing that kind of, there's like a text breadcrumb at the top of the checkout, but making that a little bit more visual. You're starting to see that a little bit more. I think we've been preaching this a lot lately, and we're starting to see that more on sites that even we haven't worked with or talked to, but making that kind of visual. And the idea is like, hey, you're at step 1 in the cart, but there's step 2, 3, 4. So like, don't sweat it too much moving forward, putting in your shipping address, what have you. And that just kind of takes the ease off a little bit of the checkout flow. So people sort of move
not committed at the early stage.
Exactly. It's like, hey, there's still kind of opt-out points later, but if they reach the finish line, they might be like, well, this has been really simple so far, and might as well.
It's like walking through a shopping mall and not knowing where, like forgetting where you parked, and it's like, oh shoot, like which parking garage should I park in?
Exactly. It's like, let's just take them there, and then you can decide at the finish line, right? So that one's really great. Again, similar results we've seen across that one, often drives people forward. The big caveat I would say is assess that test differently on desktop than on mobile, because sometimes those buyers behave a little bit differently. Sometimes on mobile, they might just want to be in shopping mode, whereas on desktop, they're buying, sometimes adversely. So we do see some instances where the test results come out flat. There's no change. But when we pull those two audiences, we see desktop loves it, mobile hates it, or vice versa, depending on the brand. So that's kind of an interesting one to break down on. Think of another one that we do quite often. Oh, another one is the sticky add to cart. Kind of seems simple, but it's the most important action on your product page. Simply a function of saying, hey, let's make sure that this is always visible and in view. So when someone's ready to take the action, it's there and present for them.
So as you scroll down the page, the add to cart button just sticks in the top.
Exactly. It'll stay there with you. The one mistake I see with that, and again, it can go negatively if you don't implement it correctly, is there's a couple, but I think the main one that I see is when it's always sticky and you don't have anything in line, you'll actually find, and I've been guilty of this before, where you're scrolling down the page and you're like, where's the add to cart button? And you can't find it because it's just hidden in plain sight. Maybe they make it go end to end so it doesn't look like a button. There's no motion to it, right?
In fact, we were just talking about Ali Jaeger earlier, so I'll just show you what I think we mean. And so as I scroll down the bag, that add to bag, it just immediately changes to a nice, very obvious banner at the top. So that's nicely implemented.
And one thing I'll throw out about that there is that animation, once it does come into view, that makes sure that it doesn't get subject to that hidden in plain sight. And it's funny enough, if you watch screen recordings, usually the cookie banner that's there by default for people, or like an announcement bar that you can close, when you show up, people close them immediately because they notice it, right? But sometimes those ones that come in at the page load and they don't animate in afterward, those just get hidden in plain sight. So you'll see people just browsing through the site, going left and right.
Visually, you're just looking through
it's like this, and I'm like, how can they stand this? But it just gets looked past. So if you do that sticky add to cart, when the inline button, they call it, when it goes off the viewport, then animate your button to come in. On desktop, usually the top is the best because that's eye level. On mobile, usually the bottom is the best because it's just close to reach with the thumb.
Cool. I'll test out the mobile side. So to summarize, hide the back button on the checkout. Show them basically more steps to the whole sort of checkout experience, and thirdly, sticky add to cart on the product pages.
Indeed.
I might add a bonus tip that it really also depends kind of on your brand at the end of the day, right? We were talking earlier about what if you sell an electric bike where the price point's, $3,000, or a premium rug or premium handbags. For me, what I would probably want to see is a lot more content, believe it or not. I don't want to get pushed straight to the product page. You might actually want to lengthen the funnel, know? And so I think, as always, just take a step back and try to put yourself in your customer's shoes as well. So ultimately what we're trying to do is reduce friction. But I think even more than that, we're just trying to be helpful.
Yeah. But I guess it's an important point that CRO does the tactic you might use would differently. So let's say, if you're in the luxury segment, you have very high AOV, I guess you use different tactics.
100%. Like, you know, I was working with Dior a few years back, and a couple examples that might throw people off is like, I would never recommend doing reviews to Dior or to a high-end luxury brand. And that's because in a lot of their brand ethoses, they're the only one qualified to speak to that product. They're not going to allow someone to be on the website and say, this is a 1-star product, right? It's like, that's the branding that they bring, right? But that doesn't mean that that works for every brand. And that's where, you know, maybe for a smaller brand, that's where authenticity comes into play. To have some poor reviews, right, on the site, even if most of them are 5 stars. So yeah, absolutely. Like the spin to wins, I'll be honest, they do often get sales, but it kills me a little bit inside every time I see one, because I'm like, there's so many ways to promote a business and to get sales, but sometimes those spin to wins, right, it kind of like gamifies the site. It can sometimes reduce the quality, and so you just want to avoid looking cheap, sort of running sales all the time. You know, that's sort of what's great for drop shippers, but that works short term, and it definitely doesn't increase someone's desire to come back and shop you again later down the road or pay a premium price. And so it's like, you know, what's that sale worth, right? If someone doesn't value your product at that point.
No, you're right. Spin to win basically turns in some kind of cheap casino experience, and just
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we did have one comment from Jazz, quite a good one. It's I think probably one I can answer partly as well. But it's, you know, how do you maintain? So, you know, obviously you guys are very data driven, but you say obviously you also have to be creative, because there's you need both, right, to be good at CRO. You've got to come up with the idea. So kind of what's the balance there?
Yeah, and hiring a person that's great creatively, great at data, and also knows how to talk to people is really hard. So yeah, no, absolutely. But I think that I think part of that creativity just comes into play with, like, you know, having just, again, it's like, not to like pat ourselves on the back too much, but it's like, I think the years of experience, you actually start to see patterns, and then you're able to really hone in on sort of like, what are those different patterns? And you usually find that there's only a few patterns for, let's call it a product page gallery, an add to cart button, right? Sizing options. And so once you sort of dialed into those patterns, now where you're able to get creative is you're able to say, let's embellish that UX with the most wild UI, right? Or just a UI that makes sense for the brand. And so I think that's kind of the biggest thing. The other thing, genuinely, I think, is when you get your quantitative data, right? Like, let's say you see a drop off in the funnel at a certain stage. Voice of customer data is so powerful to get creative. Where, for example, I was running some stuff on the checkout. I saw big drop offs in the checkout for this brand. It was like the biggest drop off I've ever seen. And I was like, all right, like, why are, I don't know, 80% of people dropping off at this one stage, at like the payment stage? It seems so late in the game. They already knew the price. Like, what's going on? So the quantitative data gave me that. Then I went in and I ran a survey. And dangerous as it was, I put it for 5% of traffic in the checkout and said, what do you think? You know, or like something like that. I don't remember. But basically, I found that it was a cryptocurrency hardware wallet called Ledger. Actually, they were like one of the big names. And we found that customers thought they could pay with Bitcoin, but they didn't think they could. Super interesting, because the option was right there in front of them. And what we realized is people weren't associating, because the company they used was BitPay. They didn't associate that with like paying with Bitcoin. They just didn't know what BitPay was. And so
BitPay was the currency rather than the
exactly. It was like, all right, that's an obvious thing where you think you're doing something right. The customer tells you you're not. So we would have never done that. But I think that creativity came from customers mentioning that. And, you know, one of our big practices now with merchants. So the answer to that was like, we put a Bitcoin logo in there and people immediately recognized it. But the answer to that now is we'll actually use, you know, customer surveys, customer reviews, and we'll do like mining on them. There's what's called like aspect-based sentiment analysis. where effectively kind of like what you see in Amazon reviews, it's like people said this, people said that, and they now highlight them with red or green as like, is this like the smell, is that a positive smell or is it a bad smell? So we actually do some of that now to kind of more or less like listen and benchmark what the customers are saying. And then sometimes we find things that we would have had no idea about before.
Okay, let's move on. The other topic I want to cover was just around one of the big news in the A/B testing world, which was Google Optimize and its sunset. It was a bit of a sort of sudden announcement. I guess a lot of people had got quite used to that tool. Seemed to be working pretty well. I guess the first question is, why do you think that happened? I mean, what went wrong for Google there?
You might add some historical context too, Yusuf, because I think that in the past there have been changes, but this time it fully sunsetted, right?
Yeah, they sort of. I think people were skeptical when they first announced it because they went in and out of GA multiple times. It was like, we're going to change the name and then we're going to put it inside of Google and then we're going to take it out. And there was just a lot of changes. And even at the final mile, people saw that it was still going to be, there's still going to be Firebase A/B testing for, I think, like apps or something. And so
there's a guy in the UK did a brilliant April Fool's spoof of like, right, we'll bring it back, and it was so convincing because it was so like Google the way he phrased it, and like,
I need to check that out.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so I don't know, who knows. I know that they certainly got a lot of before that. I know the community was definitely hard on them of like trying to get really hardcore like stats out of the platform. But you have to keep in mind, most people using that, they're looking for a Toyota, not for a Ferrari. And so, if you told someone statistical significance versus probability to be best, right? It's like, what makes more sense to 90% of users? And so I think they were aiming to be a little bit more of a user-friendly platform. Maybe that ostracized some power users, but I don't think that's the reason. My guess is that I think like anything at Google, it seems like if it's not a multi-$100 million business or they don't know how to commercialize it. I think that you had free GA and Optimize, and then you had paid, and the cost jump was so massive that I think that the inability to create some sort of an in-between point, I think that's what sort of killed it. Is it's like, if you're not some massive organization, you're not going to upgrade. So
I'll also add, and we've talked about this several times, and it's affecting everyone, but we're in a high interest rate environment, so priorities only become more important. And so It's just, Google's a massive company, so it's a shock to us that they got rid of it, but it's probably not a shock to Google that they got rid of it.
Yeah, and it's probably, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ed. I mean,
so my thoughts about it's just not a very good fit with the rest of Google's business model. So Optimize is ultimately becoming a kind of enterprise SaaS product. It's freemium years, you had a free version, but that's what Google does. They don't have an enterprise sales team. They don't, they're an ad-led business, and I just think they probably got into it like, to what extent do we really want to? Basically, is the amount of money we make from selling contracts from Google Optimize ever going to be meaningful? And the answer at Google stage is no, it's not. Google Analytics makes sense because it's all the tie into their overall marketing platform, and they're happy to kind of, sell big spend on Google Ads, their Google Analytics 360 contracts, because it's all part of the services. But Optimize just felt like a kind of something that's served by a different kind of company to Google, I think.
Yeah, and it was crazy because they had, I want to say at some point when I was looking right before the sunset, it was somewhere around like 60% market share, at least as far as like some different like tool, like Built With and Waffleize, some of those, it was like 60% market share. I looked a few months after and like the market share still showed like over 40%. So there's even a lot of companies that still have this script on their website that need to take it off.
Yeah. I've seen that definitely. So I think, okay, fine. So it's gone. And so what's your alternative now for that, again, the kind of sort of mid to large brand that you're working with?
Yeah, there's so you've got a variety of options. If you have a lot of SKUs, you have a healthy budget, and you really want to like go to the moon, I would say Dynamic Yield's probably like best in breed. You got your product recommendations, but you've also got strong stats engine, recommendations, experience editor, A/B testing. Like you've got all the stuff in there, and you can start to take it cross channel too. So there's that. I think if you don't have a lot of SKUs, you're just kind of looking to get into A/B testing. So if you're like very brand new, bottom, very small budget, growthbook.io is an open source platform, very cost effective. It's feeding off of GA4 data. You can also connect it to different sources, but it's something like $20 per seat per month. So usually you'd use, and when you're paying for your data on Google, it's like you might be all in for less than $50 a month. Very cost effective, works pretty well. Every now and then you see some issues. I think the other players that are a little bit more polished are convert.com, VWO. I've seen a little bit more issues recently with VWO, so I'd say maybe kind of lean toward Convert. But there's a ton of tools out there, and there's a lot of players in between. So it really depends on like what are your SKU sets, what's the maturity of the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll drop in the guys from Shoplift who we work with, and
yeah,
and I mean I just love the brand. Apart from I think it's such a great name.
it is a great.
I think they've done a good job of kind of tightly integrating.
Tool, yeah,
to make it easy. Awesome. Well, that's about all we have time for. So it's been really great having you guys on the show. I hope you have a very great holiday season and good start to 2024. And I'll no doubt I'll see you around soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed. Appreciate you having us on.
Thanks, bye.